Her husband was buried on a Tuesday. By Friday, his fortune was already being stolen. Lady Vivian Ashworth thought grief was her greatest enemy, until she found the letter hidden inside her dead husband's desk. A conspiracy, a murder disguised as an accident, and a man condemned by lies. Subscribe now, because in London's most dangerous drawing rooms, the truth costs everything. Candlelight trembled across the mahogany walls of Ashworth House as the clock struck midnight. The rain had not stopped since the funeral. It fell in grey, relentless curtains across the rooftops of Mayfair, drumming against the tall windows of Ashworth House with a persistence that felt almost personal, as though the sky itself had decided to mourn alongside Lady Vivian Ashworth. She stood at the drawing-room window, her black crepe dress whispering softly against the Persian rug as she shifted her weight, watching the water run in small rivers along the cobblestones below. 3 days. Her husband had been dead for 3 days, and already the house felt like a different place entirely. It was not simply the silence, though the silence was profound, the kind that settles into a home after the departure of someone whose presence had been large and constant. Lord William Ashworth had been a man of considerable energy. His laugh had carried through 3 rooms. His footsteps on the marble staircase had always announced his arrival long before his face appeared in any doorway. Now the staircase was quiet. The study was quiet. The entire house breathed differently, as though it too was learning to exist without him. Vivienne pressed her fingertips lightly against the cold glass of the window. She was 31 years old, and she had been married for 7 years, and she had believed, with the particular certainty of someone who has never had serious reason to doubt, that she understood her life. She had understood its rhythms, its textures, its particular shape. She had understood William, his habits, his moods, his silences, and his laughter. She had not always been passionately in love with him in the way that poets described. Theirs had been a companionable, respectful marriage, arranged with mutual benefit and deepened over years into genuine affection. But she had known him. Or she had believed she had. The carriage accident had occurred on the 14th of November, on the road returning from his club in St. James's. The coachman had survived with a broken arm, and a story that never quite sat comfortably in Vivienne's mind. The horses had bolted without warning, he said. Something had startled them in the dark. The carriage had struck a stone wall at considerable speed, and William had been thrown. He had died before the surgeon arrived. It had been called an accident by everyone who mattered, by the physician, by the coroner, by the inspector who had visited Ashworth House the following morning with his hat in his hands and his condolences prepared. London society had received the news with the particular mixture of shock and appetite that it reserved for tragedies involving prominent families. Cards had arrived by the dozen. Flowers had filled 3 reception rooms. And Vivian had accepted it all, because what else does a widow do in the first days of grief but accept? The reading of the will had taken place that morning in the library, conducted by Mr. Harcastle, the family's solicitor, a thin and careful man who read legal documents with the expression of someone diffusing an unexploded shell. William had left everything to Vivian: Ashworth House, the Lancashire estate, the investments, the shares in 3 separate railway companies. It was a considerable fortune, and the provisions were clear. What was not clear was the matter that Mr. Harcastle had raised at the end of the reading, in a quieter voice, with his papers shuffled together and his eyes directed slightly to the left of her face. "There is one additional matter, Lady Ashworth, which I feel obliged to bring to your attention." He had paused. "Certain documents pertaining to your husband's financial affairs, specifically the records of transactions conducted in the last 18 months, appear to be missing from the files he kept here at the house. I have searched thoroughly. They are not present." Vivian had asked him what documents precisely. Correspondence, he had said. "And ledgers, records of private financial arrangements that your husband conducted separately from the main accounts I managed on his behalf." Another pause. "I was not aware of these arrangements until recently. I confess I do not fully understand them, but their absence concerns me greatly." She had thanked him and shown him out and stood in the library for a long time afterward, looking at the shelves of leather-bound books that William had collected over 20 years and rarely read. Now, standing at the drawing-room window with the rain still falling, she turned away from the glass and made a decision. She would go to his study. She had avoided it since his death, had instructed the housekeeper, Mrs. Pendleton, to leave it undisturbed, had herself walked past the closed door each morning with a careful neutrality that she recognized, even at the time, as a form of self-protection. But Hardcastle's words had settled in her chest like a stone, and the stone had grown heavier through the afternoon, and now it was evening, and she could not ignore it any longer. The study was at the end of the first-floor corridor, its door dark oak, its brass handle cold beneath her fingers. She turned the handle and pushed it open, and stood for a moment in the doorway, breathing in the smell of the room, leather and paper, and the faint ghost of the tobacco William had smoked in his pipe on winter evenings. The desk dominated the center of the room, a large, serious piece of furniture that William had inherited from his own father, its surface covered with the controlled disorder of a man who knew exactly where everything was. Vivian sat down in the chair behind it, William's chair still shaped faintly to him, and began methodically to open drawers. The first three contained what she expected: correspondence, invitations, receipts, the ordinary administrative debris of a prosperous life. The fourth contained a locked compartment she had not known existed. She found the key in the fifth drawer, tucked beneath a leather blotter. A small brass key on a simple ring, unremarkable except for the fact that it had been hidden. She held it in her palm for a moment, aware of a cold feeling spreading through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The compartment opened smoothly. Inside were 3 items: a small leather ledger, its pages dense with figures and initials, a folded document that appeared to be a contract of some kind, signed at the bottom with 2 signatures she could not immediately read in the low light, and a letter unsealed written in William's hand, dated the 9th of November, 5 days before his death. She read the letter first. It was addressed to no one. It was written in the manner of a man organizing his thoughts under considerable pressure, the sentences sometimes incomplete, the handwriting less controlled than William's usual precise script. She read it twice, and then a third time, her hands entirely still in her lap. I have made a grave error in trusting V with the extent of my difficulties. What began as a private loan has become something I cannot name cleanly in writing. He knows about the railway contracts. He knows about Pemberton. If I attempt to withdraw the arrangement, he has made clear what the consequences will be. I do not know how to proceed. I fear that whatever I decide, the outcome for V, for my wife, will be severe. I should have told her. I should have told her from the beginning. God forgive me, I should have told her. The letter ended there, mid-thought, as though he had been interrupted or had simply been unable to continue. Vivian sat in the dark study for a long time with the letter in her hands and the rain against the windows and the house entirely silent around her. V. The initial appeared twice, once as the person William had trusted with the extent of his difficulties, once as the name of someone who had become a threat. There was only one person in William's life whose name began with V, outside of Vivian herself: his brother, Victor Ashworth. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the compartment. Then she closed the ledger without reading it. She would read it tomorrow in daylight with a clearer mind, and locked the compartment and held the small brass key in her closed fist. Outside, the rain continued. Somewhere below she heard Mrs. Pendleton moving through the kitchen, the distant sound of a kettle, the ordinary sounds of a house continuing to exist. Vivian thought about the word accident. She thought about the coroner's report. She thought about the coachman's story, the horses bolting without warning, something startling them in the dark, and she thought about how easily that story could be constructed by someone who knew the road, who knew William's habits, who knew exactly which evening he would be returning from his club. She thought about Victor Ashworth, who had arrived at Ashworth House within hours of William's death, with his face arranged in the correct expression of grief, who had sat across from her in this very drawing-room and held her hand and told her that his brother had loved her very much. She stood up from the desk. She was 31 years old, and she was a widow, and she had, until 3 hours ago, believed she understood her life. She had believed that grief was the thing she needed to survive, and that survival was simply a matter of time. She understood now that she had been wrong. Grief was not her enemy. The man who had killed her husband was. London had a particular way of deciding things. It did not require evidence or deliberation, or the slow machinery of courts and inquiries. It required only a drawing room, a well-placed whisper, and the right pair of ears to receive it. By the time a story had travelled from one end of Mayfair to the other, passed between ladies at morning calls, exchanged behind fans at evening receptions, relayed in hushed, significant tones across tea tables set with bone china and fresh flowers, it had acquired the solidity of established fact, regardless of whether it had ever been true, and London had decided with its customary efficiency that Lord Edmund Calloway was responsible for the death of William Ashworth. The reasoning, as Vivian understood it, from the careful apologetic account delivered by her closest friend, Mrs. Helena Forsyth, over tea on the 4th day after the funeral, went as follows. Edmund Calloway had been William's business partner in the railway venture. The venture had encountered difficulties. There had been, here Helena had lowered her voice with practiced delicacy, financial disagreements. Edmund Calloway had debts of his own, considerable ones, accumulated over several years of what society politely termed unfortunate investments and less politely termed recklessness. He had been seen arguing with William at his club 2 weeks before the accident, and he had notably no alibi for the evening of the 14th. "I'm not saying it is true," Helena said, setting down her teacup with the careful precision of a woman who was, in fact, saying exactly that. "I'm only telling you what is being said. You ought to know, Vivian. People are talking, people are always talking," Vivian said. "Yes, but this is different." Helena's eyes were kind and worried in equal measure. She was a small, fair woman with an instinct for social weather that Vivian had long relied upon. "This has the feel of something that will not pass quickly. Victor has been—" She hesitated. "Victor has been what?" "Present," Helena said, choosing the word with care. "He has been very present in various drawing rooms this week, very visible, very concerned, one might say, with the question of what happened to his brother." Vivian said nothing. She looked at the fire and thought about the letter locked in William's desk, and the initial V written twice in her dead husband's hand, and the particular quality of Victor Ashworth's grief, which she had been examining in her memory with increasing attention over the past 4 days. "Thank you, Helena," she said finally. "You are a good friend." She saw Edmund Calloway for the first time since the funeral 3 days later, at a reception hosted by Lady Portsmouth in her house on Grosvenor Square. Vivian had not intended to attend. Her period of mourning made public appearances a complicated matter of protocol and judgment, but Helena had argued, with some force, that remaining entirely invisible would only fuel the stories circulating about Ashworth House, and that a brief, dignified appearance would serve Vivian better than continued absence. She had worn black silk, simply cut, with no jewellery except the small pearl earrings William had given her on their first anniversary. She had stood near the edge of the room with Helena beside her, and a glass of untouched champagne in her hand, and she had watched. The reception was well attended. Lady Portsmouth's events always were. She had the gift of assembling people who disliked each other in sufficient numbers that the resulting friction generated an atmosphere of excitement that everyone enjoyed, and no one admitted to enjoying. The rooms were lit with 100 candles, and the smell of hothouse flowers mingled with expensive perfume and the faint underlayer of coal smoke that permeated every London interior in November. Conversation moved around Vivian in waves, and she received condolences with the measured gratitude of a woman who had delivered that particular performance many times in the past 2 weeks. She noticed Edmund Calloway the moment he entered. He was taller than she remembered. She had met him perhaps 4 or 5 times over the years, always briefly, always in the context of William's business affairs, and she had formed only a general impression of him. Dark-haired, serious, possessed of a reserve that could be mistaken for coldness. Tonight he wore it differently. There was something tighter about him, something held carefully in check, like a man who has decided before entering a room that he will not allow it to touch him. He was accompanied by no one. That, in itself, was a statement. She watched him move through the reception with a kind of controlled deliberateness, acknowledging greetings with minimal response, deflecting the particular quality of attention that a room directs at someone who has become interesting for the wrong reasons. She saw 2 gentlemen near the fireplace turn to observe him as he passed. She saw Lady Portsmouth's eyes track him from across the room with an expression that combined fascination and wariness in precisely equal parts. And then she saw Victor. Her brother-in-law was standing in a group near the far window, a glass of wine in his hand, his face arranged in the expression she had come to study with something approaching clinical attention. Sorrow, dignity, a grief worn publicly and worn well. He was a handsome man, Victor Ashworth, 4 years younger than William had been, with the same dark colouring and considerably more natural charm. He had always known how to be looked at. As Edmund Calloway passed within 20 feet of him, Victor turned, not obviously, not with any theatrical intent, but with the precise timing of someone who had been watching for exactly this moment, and allowed his gaze to rest on Edmund for 3 seconds before looking away. It was enough. The room registered it without knowing it had registered it. The whisper of the glance moved invisibly through the assembled company and reinforced, without a single word being spoken, everything that had already been said in a dozen drawing rooms over the past week. Vivian set down her untouched champagne. She moved through the room with the slow, purposeful navigation of a woman who knows exactly where she is going, but intends to appear merely circulating. She passed the fireplace, nodded to 2 acquaintances, accepted another set of condolences from a colonel's wife who smelled overwhelmingly of roses, and arrived, by a route that she hoped appeared entirely coincidental, at the corner of the room where Edmund Calloway was standing alone, examining a painting he almost certainly had no interest in. "Lord Calloway," she said quietly. He turned. His eyes were grey, she noticed, and they moved over her face with an alertness that was not unfriendly, but was very far from comfortable. He bowed, correctly, precisely, the bow of a man who has been raised to observe every form and will observe them regardless of circumstance. "Lady Ashworth," he said. His voice was low and controlled. "I am sorry for your loss. You have said so already at the funeral. It bears repeating." She looked at him directly. "How are you finding this evening, Lord Calloway?" A slight pause. Something shifted in his expression, not enough to be visible to anyone watching from across the room, but enough for her, standing this close. "Instructive," he said. "Yes," she said. "I imagine it is." There was a silence between them that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and contained, she felt, a considerable amount of unspoken information. He was watching her with the wariness of a man who has learned, recently and sharply, not to trust the approach of anyone in a social setting. She understood it. She did not blame him for it. "My husband kept records," she said, her voice barely above a murmur, pitched for him alone beneath the surrounding noise of the reception. Private records, documents relating to his financial affairs in the last 18 months. She paused. They raised certain questions. Edmund Calloway said nothing, but he had gone very still. "I am not yet certain what those questions are," she continued. "I am in the process of understanding them. But I believe—" She stopped, began again, more carefully. "I believe that the story this room has decided upon is not the correct one." For a long moment he simply looked at her. She held his gaze without difficulty, which seemed to surprise him. "Lady Ashworth," he said finally, very quietly, "I would counsel you to be extremely careful." "I am being careful," she said. "I am also being honest." She allowed a brief pause. "I wonder if we might find occasion to speak more privately. Not here and not soon. That would be inadvisable. But in time." He studied her face with the particular attention of a man trying to determine whether he is being offered something genuine or something dangerous. She suspected from his expression that his recent experience had made it difficult to distinguish between the two. "In time," he said at last. She inclined her head slightly and moved away, drifting back through the reception, with the unhurried grace of a woman simply paying her social respects. And she did not look back at him, and she did not look toward Victor, and she kept her expression entirely composed until she reached Helena's side and accepted a fresh glass of champagne that she this time actually drank. "You spoke to him," Helena said, very quietly, not looking at her. "Briefly," Vivian said. "Vivian." Helena's voice carried a careful weight. "Be careful. "Everyone keeps telling me that," Vivian said. She looked across the room. Victor was watching her from his position near the window, his expression unchanged, his eyes steady on her face. He raised his glass slightly, a small private gesture, a salutation between family members at a social gathering, and smiled. She smiled back, and she thought, "I see you, and I am coming." The ledger took her 4 days to understand. It was not written in code precisely, but it had the quality of a document, composed by a man who wished to record everything without making anything immediately legible to an uninvited reader. William had used initials throughout, V, A appearing with disturbing frequency, and abbreviated references to transactions that required cross-referencing with the railway company's public records, which Vivian had quietly obtained through Mr. Harcastle under the pretext of settling the estate accounts. She worked at William's desk each morning after breakfast, before the household had fully woken, in the grey November light that came through the study windows and fell across the pages with a cold, useful clarity. Mrs. Pendleton had learned not to disturb her during these hours. The housekeeper was a perceptive woman of 53 who had served Ashworth House for 19 years and who had, Vivian suspected, understood more about the state of the household than she had ever been asked to confirm. By the 4th morning, the shape of it had become clear enough to make her sit back in William's chair with her hands flat on the desk and stare at the far wall for a long time. Victor had approached William approximately 20 months ago with a proposal. On the surface, it was a private loan arrangement. Victor had debts, gambling debts, she now understood, of a scale that would have been catastrophic if made public, and William, as the elder brother and head of the family, had agreed to assist him quietly, drawing the funds from the railway investment accounts in a manner that concealed their true destination. It was irregular, certainly. Possibly illegal, depending on the precise nature of the railway company's articles of incorporation. But it was the kind of irregular transaction that wealthy families conducted quietly every generation or so, and it would have remained simply that, a family embarrassment, managed discreetly and eventually resolved, except that Victor had apparently used it as leverage. The word Pemberton appeared 3 times in the ledger, always in connection with a separate set of transactions that Vivian had not yet been able to fully trace. She wrote it in her own notebook and underlined it twice. It was a name, she was fairly certain, a person rather than a place, and it connected to something William had described in his letter as the railway contracts, which suggested involvement at a level beyond the family loan arrangement. What she understood clearly enough was this: Victor had known about the irregular withdrawals. Victor had ensured that William knew he knew, and Victor had used that knowledge to bind his brother into something larger and more dangerous than a private loan, something that William had spent the last months of his life trying to find a way out of, and had not found. She locked the ledger back in the compartment and held the brass key in her palm and thought about what came next. What came next, she had already decided, was Edmund Calloway. Getting a private message to Edmund Calloway without attracting attention required more ingenuity than Vivian had initially anticipated. She could not write to him directly. A letter from a recently widowed woman to a man publicly suspected of involvement in her husband's death would be read by half of London before it reached its destination. She could not ask Helena to act as intermediary. Helena was trustworthy but frightened, and frightened people made mistakes. She could not approach him again at a social gathering without the encounter being observed and interpreted by precisely the people she needed to keep uninformed. In the end, it was Mrs. Pendleton who solved the problem, in the indirect way that highly capable household staff often solve problems they have not been explicitly asked to address. "If I may, my lady," the housekeeper said one morning, appearing in the study doorway with a tray of correspondence and an expression of careful neutrality. "Lord Calloway's man, his valet, a Mr. Sykes, attends the same church as my sister's husband, St. George's, Hanover Square, the 8 o'clock service on Thursdays." Vivian looked at her. "I mention it merely as a matter of general interest," Mrs. Pendleton said, and set down the tray and withdrew. The note Vivian wrote was 11 words long. "I have read the ledger. We need to speak. V.A." She sealed it herself, gave it to Mrs. Pendleton without further discussion, and waited. Edmund Calloway arrived at Ashworth House on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days later, entering through the servants' entrance on the side street as she had instructed, admitted by Mrs. Pendleton with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had decided to become complicit in something and intended to do it properly. Vivian received him in the small sitting room at the back of the house, a room rarely used, overlooking the winter garden, chosen for the precise reason that it had no sight line from the street. She had positioned 2 chairs near the fire and poured tea herself, declining to have a maid present, a decision that she was aware violated approximately every social convention governing the reception of unmarried gentlemen by widowed ladies, and which she had made with complete equanimity. He entered with the contained wariness she had observed at Lady Portsmouth's reception, his hat in his hands, his dark coat still carrying the cold of the November street. He looked at the tea and at the chairs and at her, and appeared to make several rapid assessments before sitting down. "You took a considerable risk," he said. "It was not an accusation precisely, but it was not entirely not one either. Less of a risk than continuing without information," she said. "Milk?" He accepted tea with the slightly disoriented expression of a man who had prepared himself for a difficult conversation and was finding the normalcy of the rituals somewhat destabilizing. She allowed herself a private moment of satisfaction. She had learned, over 7 years of managing a prominent household and its associated social obligations, that the ordinary gestures of hospitality were among the most effective tools available for setting the terms of an encounter. "I should tell you," he said, once the tea had been poured and the first sip taken, "that I had nothing to do with William's death." "I know that," she said. He studied her. "You know it, or you believe it?" "I know it," she said. "The ledger makes it clear. You were being used as a distraction. The evidence against you is not organic, it was assembled. The argument at the club, the timing, the absence of an alibi. Someone ensured you were in the correct position to be pointed at." A long silence. Edmund set down his teacup with great care. "The argument at the club," he said slowly, "was about the railway accounts. William came to me 3 weeks before he died. He told me that funds had been misappropriated. He didn't tell me by whom, not directly, but he was frightened, which William never was, and he asked me to say nothing until he had resolved it himself." He paused. I agreed. "Which in retrospect was precisely what someone wanted me to do." "Because it gave you knowledge and silence simultaneously," Vivian said, "which made you useful as a suspect. You knew about the financial irregularities, you had argued with him, you had reason, apparent reason, to want the matter suppressed permanently." "Yes." His voice was quiet. "That is a very neat construction. It is an extremely neat construction," she agreed, "which is itself evidence of careful planning. Accidents are not neat. Conspiracies are." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, a reassessment, conducted rapidly and with some difficulty, of a woman he had not previously been required to take seriously in any investigative capacity. She did not find it offensive. She found it useful information about his character, that he was capable of reassessment and that he conducted it honestly rather than concealing its necessity. "The name Pemberton," she said. "It appears 3 times in William's ledger. Do you know it?" Something moved behind his eyes. "Yes," he said. "Arthur Pemberton. He is a solicitor, not Harcastle, a different man, one with connections to several of the newer railway ventures and to certain financial interests in the city that I have never been entirely comfortable with." He paused. "He and Victor Ashworth have been acquainted for at least 3 years. I know this because William mentioned it to me once in passing, as a thing he found slightly curious. He did not explain why." Vivian wrote the name in her notebook. She had brought it to the meeting deliberately, a decision that had produced a slight widening of Edmund's eyes when she first opened it, and added city connections beneath it. "I need access to the railway company's private transaction records," she said. "Not the public accounts, the internal ledgers." William's copy was among the documents that went missing after his death. I believe Victor took them the night he came to the house, in the hours before the other family members arrived. But the company itself will hold copies. "I am a partner in that company," Edmund said. "Or I was. My position has become complicated in recent weeks. Can you still access the records?" He considered this. "If I move carefully and quickly, before the board has opportunity to formalize any change in my status. Yes, I believe so. Then that is what we need, she said. Another silence, different in quality from the earlier ones, not wary, not assessing, but the silence of two people who have reached the point in a conversation where the theoretical becomes practical and the implications of what they are agreeing to become concrete and real. Lady Ashworth, Edmund said, I want to be direct with you about something. Please, if we pursue this, if we are seen to pursue this, or even if we are not seen but Victor suspects it, the consequences will not be limited to social discomfort. Victor Ashworth is not a man who responds to threat with restraint. He has already, if your theory is correct, arranged the death of his own brother. He held her gaze steadily. I want you to understand what you are choosing. I understand it perfectly, Vivian said. My husband wrote 5 days before he died that he feared for my safety. He feared what Victor would do once the situation reached its conclusion. She paused. William chose to protect me by keeping me ignorant, and it did not protect me at all, because Victor will come for the fortune regardless of what I know or don't know. The only variable is whether I am prepared when he does. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then, William was a good man. He was, she said. He made mistakes, but he was a good man. She straightened slightly. I intend to make sure his death counts for something. Outside the sitting-room window, the winter garden was grey and bare, the rose bushes stripped to their thorny architecture, the fountain dry and still. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock chimed the half-hour. The fire crackled. There is one more thing, Vivian said. Victor will be watching me. He was watching me at Lady Portsmouth's reception. I am certain of it. He knows I have access to the study, and while I believe he took the documents he considered most dangerous, he cannot be entirely sure what William left behind. She paused. He will also, I suspect, begin to apply pressure toward the financial matters soon. He will want control of the estate accounts before the question of probate is settled. He would need you to sign documents for that. Yes. And I will not sign them. She met his eyes. But I need to ensure that my refusal does not alert him too quickly. He needs to believe for as long as possible that I am simply a grieving widow who does not yet understand what she has. Something that might, in other circumstances, have been a smile moved briefly across Edmund Calloway's face. I suspect, he said, that Victor Ashworth has significantly underestimated you. Most people do, Vivian said pleasantly. I find it very useful. She stood, indicating the conclusion of the meeting, and he rose with her. At the door of the sitting room he paused. I will contact you through the same channel when I have accessed the railway records, he said. It will take perhaps a week. I will wait to hear from you, she said. He nodded, not the formal bow of the reception, but something simpler, the acknowledgement between two people who have agreed to something real. And Mrs. Pendleton appeared from the corridor to show him out through the servants' entrance, quiet and efficient as ever. Vivian stood in the empty sitting room and listened to the house settle around her. 1 week. She had 1 week before Edmund returned with the railway records, and she needed to spend it carefully, maintaining the appearance of a widow absorbed in grief and estate management, keeping Victor satisfied that she was proceeding exactly as he expected, and continuing to trace the name Pemberton through every avenue available to her. She closed her notebook and looked out at the bare winter garden. Somewhere across London, Victor Ashworth was moving through drawing rooms with his grief worn publicly, and his glass raised in fraternal salutation, and he believed himself entirely safe. He would not believe it much longer. The name Pemberton opened doors that Vivian had not expected. She began where she always began, with unfamiliar names, in William's professional world, with Mr. Harcastle. The solicitor received her in his offices on Bedford Row on a grey Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that London produced in December with reliable efficiency. Cold without being dramatic, the sky the colour of old pewter, the streets outside his window busy with the particular purposeful misery of people who had somewhere to be and no pleasure in getting there. She had prepared her approach carefully. She did not ask about Pemberton directly. She asked instead about the railway company's legal structure, specifically about whether the company had engaged any solicitors in addition to Hardcastle's own firm for specialized matters. It was the kind of question a newly widowed woman managing a complex estate might reasonably ask, and Hardcastle answered it without apparent suspicion. There was one other firm engaged, he said, consulting a file with his customary careful movements for certain negotiations relating to land acquisition along the proposed northern route. A Mr. Arthur Pemberton, of Pemberton and Associates, Gray's Inn Road. He paused, his eyes moving over the file with a slight increase in attention that Vivienne noted. I was not involved in those negotiations myself. Your husband handled them directly. Was that unusual, she asked, for William to handle legal matters without your involvement? Hardcastle set the file down with the precise alignment of a man buying himself a moment to think. It was not his custom, he said carefully. No. She thanked him and left with what she needed, an address. She did not go to Pemberton's offices herself. That, she had decided, would be a step too far. A recently widowed woman appearing unannounced at the Gray's Inn Road offices of a solicitor connected to her husband's death would generate precisely the kind of attention she could not afford. Instead, she sent a proxy. The proxy was Thomas, the Ashworth House footman, a young man of 22 with a forgettable face and an excellent memory, whom Vivienne had employed for 2 years and trusted completely, partly because he was genuinely loyal, and partly because she paid him well enough to make loyalty a rational as well as an emotional choice. She gave him a list of questions framed as inquiries about document retrieval, plausible enough for a solicitor's clerk to answer without alarm, and sent him to Gray's Inn Road on a Wednesday afternoon. He returned with more than she had expected. The offices were busy, my lady, he reported, standing in the study with his hat in his hands and the focused expression of a young man who had paid close attention to everything. 2 clerks, an older gentleman I took to be Mr. Pemberton himself, and one visitor who was leaving as I arrived. He paused. The visitor, Vivienne said, Mr. Victor Ashworth, my lady. I recognized him from the funeral. He and Mr. Pemberton were speaking in the doorway as I came up the steps. They stopped when they saw me. Mr. Pemberton asked my business. I gave him the inquiry you prepared, and he told me the documents could not be released without written authorization from the estate. Thomas paused again, but before I left I heard Mr. Pemberton say something to his clerk. He didn't know I could still hear. I was on the stairs. He said, "Tell him the timetable moves forward, before the month is out." Vivienne was still for a moment. "Before the month is out," she repeated. "Yes, my lady, December then. Whatever Victor was planning, whatever the next move in the transfer of control of the Ashworth fortune required, he intended it within the month." The pressure she had been anticipating was coming faster than she had calculated. She thanked Thomas and sent him out and sat at the desk and wrote 2 words in her notebook. Timetable. December. Then she wrote a note to Edmund Calloway through Mrs. Pendleton's established channel, short and direct. "It is more urgent than we thought. Whatever you can find it quickly." Edmund's response arrived the following morning, and it was not a note. It was a meeting request, delivered through the same channel, with an address she did not recognize on the Strand, and a time 6 o'clock in the evening, when the winter dark had already settled over the city, and the gaslit streets provided both illumination and the useful anonymity of crowds. She went in a plain hired cab, rather than the Ashworth carriage, dressed without particular distinction, accompanied only by her personal maid, Dora, a woman of 40 with a broad, calm face and the temperament of someone who has long since decided that the world is surprising, and that the appropriate response to surprise is competence rather than alarm. The address proved to be a small, respectable hotel on a side street off the Strand, the kind of establishment patronized by provincial solicitors and minor gentry visiting London for business, its lobby quiet and its staff professionally incurious. Edmund was waiting in a private sitting room on the first floor, and he had spread a considerable quantity of documents across the table when she arrived. He looked, she noticed, as though he had not slept particularly well. "I accessed the records," he said without preamble. "It took longer than I anticipated, because someone had been through them before me, recently within the last 2 weeks. Several pages had been removed. Not carefully enough, however." He indicated a series of documents on the left side of the table. These are the transaction records for the 18 months prior to William's death. And this, he moved to the right side, is what I found when I cross-referenced them with the land acquisition files. Vivian sat down and looked at what he had laid out. It took her 20 minutes to read through it, asking Edmund occasional clarifying questions, which he answered with precise economy. When she reached the end, she sat back and looked at the fire burning in the small grate and thought about what she now knew. It was worse than she had imagined, and she had imagined something fairly terrible. Pemberton had not simply been a solicitor engaged for land negotiations. He had been the architect of a scheme that used the railway company's land acquisition process as a mechanism for diverting significant funds into accounts controlled, ultimately by Victor Ashworth. The mechanism was intricate, involving falsified land valuations, payments to non-existent landowners, and the layering of transactions through 3 separate intermediary firms. But its essential nature was straightforward: theft, conducted with legal sophistication, from a company in which William held the primary stake. William had discovered it approximately 8 months before his death. That much was clear from the dates on certain internal memoranda that Edmund had found. He had not gone to the authorities. Because Vivian now understood, Victor had immediately made clear that the irregular family loan arrangement gave him sufficient leverage to destroy William's reputation alongside his own, if the matter became public. They had been locked together in it, William unable to expose Victor without exposing himself, Victor unable to proceed without William's continued silence, both of them trapped in a construction that could only end badly. Until Victor had decided to end it on his own terms. "There is one more thing," Edmund said. He had been watching her read with a stillness that she had come to associate with him, not passivity, but a focused, patient quality of attention that she found, she realized, unexpectedly steadying. He moved a single sheet of paper to the front of the arrangement. "This is a transfer document. It was prepared by Pemberton's firm approximately 6 weeks before William's death. It would transfer controlling interest in the railway company's assets to a holding entity, here," he pointed, "which is registered in Victor Ashworth's name through 2 intermediaries." Vivian looked at the document. "It was never executed," she said. "No, because William never signed it." Edmund paused. "But it was prepared. Which means Victor had already decided, 6 weeks before the accident, that William's voluntary cooperation was no longer something he intended to rely upon." The room was very quiet. Outside, the sounds of the Strand, hooves, wheels, distant voices, filtered through the window with the muffled quality of a world proceeding normally, entirely indifferent to what was being understood in this small upstairs room. "He planned it in advance," Vivian said. "Not a question. The document suggests premeditation, yes. He had already arranged the legal mechanism for acquiring William's assets. The accident," Edmund's voice was controlled and careful, "removed the obstacle." Vivian looked at the transfer document for a long moment. She thought about William writing his letter in the study, the incomplete sentences, the frightened handwriting, the final lines about what he should have told her. She thought about the coachman's story and the darkness on the road to St. James's and the horses that had bolted without warning. She thought about Victor at the funeral and at the reception, and raising his glass to her across Lady Portsmouth's drawing room. "We need to keep all of this," she said, gesturing at the documents, "secured and copied. Not at Ashworth House. Victor has access to the house through family privilege, and I cannot be certain he hasn't had someone watching the servants." She thought for a moment. Harcastle. "Despite everything, he is a legitimate solicitor with no connection to Victor, and his offices are secure. If I can frame it correctly, as a precautionary measure relating to the estate, he will hold documents without asking questions he doesn't wish to answer." "I can provide copies," Edmund said. "I made 2 sets when I extracted the originals. One remains where I have it secured. One is for you." He produced a leather document case and placed it on the table before her. Their fingers were close briefly as she reached for it, close enough that she was aware of it, in the way one becomes aware of small physical details in moments of high concentration. She did not remark upon it. Neither did he. "Victor is moving on a December timetable," she said, and relayed what Thomas had overheard on the steps of Pemberton's offices. She watched Edmund's expression sharpen as she spoke. "Before the month is out," he said. "That gives us at most 3 weeks. Possibly less." She looked at the document case in her hands. "He will come to me with documents to sign. He has been patient, more patient than I expected, but Pemberton told him to move, which means something in the legal arrangement requires my signature before a deadline. When he does," Edmund said carefully, "you cannot simply refuse. If he suspects you know what you know, he will not wait." "I know." She met his eyes. "I will not refuse. I will delay." There is a difference between a widow who refuses to sign documents and a widow who is overwhelmed, confused, grieving, and requires her own solicitor to review everything before she can in good conscience put her name to anything. A brief pause. "I can perform overwhelmed and confused with considerable conviction when required." Edmund looked at her. That quality of reassessment was in his expression again. The same rapid, honest recalibration she had observed in the sitting room at Ashworth House, and this time there was something else alongside it. Not quite admiration, or not only admiration. Something more complex and less easily named. "Lady Ashworth," he said. "Vivian," she said, without particularly planning to. "Given the circumstances, I think the formality has become somewhat absurd." A pause. "Vivian," he said. The word was careful, as though he were testing the weight of it. "I want to say something that I hope you will receive in the spirit in which it is intended." She waited. "When this is finished," he said, and the phrase "when this is finished" contained within it an entire assumption about the outcome that she found, she realized, deeply fortifying. "You should leave London for a while, somewhere quiet. You will need it." She looked at him for a moment. "And you?" she asked. He seemed slightly surprised by the question, as though the inclusion of himself in any post-resolution future had not yet occurred to him as a natural consideration. "I expect I will have a railway company to reconstruct," he said. "Yes," she said. "I suppose you will." She picked up the document case and stood, and Dora, who had been sitting with remarkable patience in the corner of the room with her hands folded, rose alongside her. At the door, Vivian paused. "Edmund," she said. The name felt different from his title, smaller, more direct, more real. "Be careful with the documents you're holding. Victor knows you had access to the railway files. If he suspects you've extracted copies, I am aware of the risk," he said. "Good." She held his gaze for a moment. "Then we understand each other." She left him standing in the small upstairs room, with the documents spread across the table and the fire burning low in the grate, and she descended the stairs and stepped out into the cold noise of the Strand, and she held the document case against her side under her cloak, and thought about December and timetables and the particular expression on Edmund Calloway's face when he had said, "When this is finished," as though the ending were not in doubt. She needed it not to be in doubt. She walked to the hired cab with Dora beside her, and the gaslit city moving all around her and December closing in, and she made herself think only about what needed to be done next, and not about anything else at all. Victor came on a Wednesday. Vivian had been expecting him in truth, since Thomas had overheard Pemberton's instruction on the steps of Gray's Inn Road, but the timing still required her to compose herself in the 30 seconds between Mrs. Pendleton's quiet announcement and her brother-in-law's appearance in the drawing-room doorway. 30 seconds was enough. She had learned over the past weeks that she was capable of a great deal in very little time. He looked well. That was the first thing she noted, with the clinical attention she now brought to every observation of Victor Ashworth. He was dressed with his customary elegance, his dark coat brushed to perfection, his expression arranged in the precise combination of familial affection and fraternal concern that he had worn consistently since William's death. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm, which he set down on the side table with a casualness so studied it was nearly imperceptible. Nearly. Vivian. He crossed the room and took both her hands briefly in the manner of a concerned family member, and she allowed it with the warmth of a woman who has nothing to hide. "You look pale. Are you sleeping?" "Tolerably," she said. "Sit down, Victor. Mrs. Pendleton will bring tea." He sat. She sat across from him and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him, with the mild, slightly unfocused expression she had been practicing. The expression of a woman still moving through grief's softer, more bewildered stages, capable of affection and gratitude but not perhaps of sharp attention. It was, she found, not entirely unlike a performance she had given at various points in her social life. The composed wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who makes everyone in the room comfortable by reflecting back to them exactly what they wish to see. She had always been good at it. She had simply never previously had occasion to deploy it against someone who was trying to destroy her. "I've been thinking about you constantly," Victor said, accepting his tea with the ease of a man entirely at home. "This whole situation, the estate, the legal matters, all of it falling on you at once. It's too much for anyone, Vivian." William would have hated it. William would have handled it differently, she agreed, with a smile that implied only grief and no subtext whatsoever. Exactly. Victor set down his cup and leaned forward slightly, the movement of a man transitioning from social warmth to practical concern. "Which is why I want to help. As family. As someone who understood William's affairs and can guide you through the more complicated aspects." He gestured toward the portfolio. "I've had Pemberton draw up some documents, quite straightforward really, that would allow me to act as a co-administrator of the estate accounts during the probate period. Purely temporary, purely protective." Vivian looked at the portfolio with the expression of a woman confronting an unfamiliar and slightly overwhelming object. "Documents," she said. "Standard legal instruments," Victor said. Pemberton explained everything quite clearly. "It simply means that during this transitional period, you won't be alone in managing the financial side. I can handle the railway matters, the investment accounts, all the things William managed that you've never had to concern yourself with." The phrase "never had to concern yourself with" was, she noted, doing considerable work in that sentence. She allowed it to do its work without comment. "I appreciate that enormously," she said. "You know, I've always found the financial matters rather bewildering. William used to say I had no head for numbers at all." She paused and produced a small rueful laugh that contained not a single molecule of irony. "I'm afraid he was quite right." Victor smiled, the warm, relieved smile of a man whose plan is proceeding exactly as anticipated. "Then let me take that burden from you. If you could simply—" "I would feel so much better," Vivian said, "if I could have Mr. Hardcastle look at them first." A beat of silence. Very brief, half a second, perhaps less, but she caught it. "Of course," Victor said. "Naturally. That's entirely sensible. He's been so helpful with the estate matters," she continued, in the mildly conversational tone of a woman thinking aloud rather than making a calculated argument. "I've come to rely on him completely. I wouldn't feel comfortable signing anything without his review, you understand? It's not that I don't trust you absolutely, Victor. It's simply that William always said one should never sign a document one's own solicitor hasn't seen." She paused. "It was almost the only financial advice he ever gave me, and I feel I ought to honor it. The appeal to William's memory was, she thought, a particularly clean touch." "Of course," Victor said again. His voice remained warm. His eyes did not. "Have Hardcastle review them by all means. I'll leave the copies with you, Eve." He lifted the portfolio and extracted a sheaf of documents, which he placed on the low table between them with a deliberateness that she recognized as a form of pressure. The documents present in the room, physical, waiting, their existence creating its own subtle momentum towards signature. There's no great urgency, naturally, but the probate process does move faster with these instruments in place, and I'd hate for any avoidable complications to arise. "I'll send them to Hardcastle tomorrow morning," she said. "Wonderful." He picked up his tea again, and the conversation shifted smoothly and sociably to other matters: the family Christmas arrangements, a cousin's recent engagement, the social calendar for the new year. Victor was, she had always known, an excellent conversationalist, fluid, interested, capable of making whoever he was speaking with feel attended to and valued. She gave him 40 minutes. At the end of 40 minutes, she allowed herself to appear gently fatigued, a slight dimming of attention, a small apologetic gesture toward the window and the fading afternoon light, and he departed with every expression of affectionate concern, pressing her hands again at the door and telling her that William would have been proud of how she was managing. She smiled and thanked him, and waited until she heard the front door close before she sat down in the nearest chair and looked at the documents he had left on the table. They were, as Edmund had predicted, exactly what the railway transaction records had indicated. Instruments designed to give Victor co-administrative control over the estate accounts, framed in language of protective intent, but constructed to provide access to the investment portfolios and through them to the railway company assets. She turned to the final page. The signature line waited, blank. She was not going to sign them. But she was going to let Victor believe, for exactly as long as she needed him to, that she might. The rumors began the following week. She heard about them first from Helena, who arrived at Ashworth House on a Monday morning with the particular expression of a friend who has difficult information and has been wrestling with whether to deliver it. "There is talk," Helena said over tea without preamble, because she had known Vivian long enough to dispense with the softening approaches. "About you and Lord Calloway." Vivian kept her expression neutral. "What kind of talk?" "The usual kind." Helena looked uncomfortable. "Someone, no one will say who, it always begins with no one will say who. Someone mentioned that Lord Calloway was seen entering Ashworth House by the servants' entrance approximately 3 weeks ago, and that he remained for some time." She paused. "And there was apparently also a private meeting in a hotel on the Strand." The hotel. Someone had seen them at the hotel on the Strand, or seen Edmund entering or leaving it, or seen the hired cab. Something had been observed and reported, and the report had been shaped into the thing that London was best at shaping observations into. "I see," Vivian said. "Vivian." Helena set down her cup with a gentle firmness. "I am not asking you to explain yourself to me. You know I would never. But I am asking you to understand what this means. If it continues, if it grows, the story will be that you and Calloway, that before William was even cold." She stopped. "Society is not forgiving of widows. You know that." "I know that," Vivian said. "And Victor?" Helena hesitated. "What about Victor?" Helena looked at her hands for a moment. "Victor was at the Forsyth dinner on Saturday. James mentioned, my husband mentioned in passing, that Victor said something about being worried about you, about your state of mind, about the influence of certain people who might not have your best interests at heart." She looked up. He said it carefully, the way he says everything carefully, but the implication was clear enough. Vivian thought about this. Victor was not, she realized, simply spreading rumors as a form of social pressure. He was constructing something more deliberate, a narrative in which Vivienne was a vulnerable, compromised widow, her judgment impaired by grief and unsuitable influence. A narrative that would be useful later, when documents needed explaining, or when a woman needed to be positioned as incapable of managing her own affairs. It was, she thought with cold clarity, quite clever. "Thank you, Helena," she said. "You are, as I have said before, a very good friend. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to be very careful," Vivian said, "and very visible." She sent a note to Edmund that afternoon. "He is moving on 2 fronts simultaneously. The documents are the financial mechanism. The rumors are the social mechanism. They are designed to position me as compromised and you as a corrupting influence, which will be used to justify whatever comes next. We must assume Victor now suspects we are working together. The timetable is accelerating. Do not come to the house or contact me through the usual channel for the next 10 days. I need to appear entirely isolated and appropriate. Trust me. V. His response arrived the following morning. Understood. One additional development you should know. I received a visit yesterday from a man I did not recognize, asking questions about my access to the railway company records. He claimed to represent the company's board, but the questions were not the questions a board's representative would ask. Someone is checking whether I extracted documents. Be careful. E. Vivian read the note twice, then held it over the candle on William's desk and watched it burn. Someone was checking on Edmund, which meant Victor either knew or strongly suspected that the records had been accessed and that Edmund was involved, which meant the window of time in which they could operate without Victor's full awareness was closing faster than she had calculated. She needed to move the documents to Harcastle. She needed to do it without being observed. And she needed to do it before Victor decided that patience had ceased to serve his purposes. She called for Mrs. Pendleton. The housekeeper appeared in the study doorway with her customary composure and waited. "I need to get a document case to Mr. Harcastle's offices on Bedford Row," Vivian said. "Not through the post. Not through Thomas, who may be being observed. And not in a manner that can be connected to me directly." She paused. "I need your sister's husband." Mrs. Pendleton considered this for precisely 3 seconds. "He makes deliveries to that part of the city on Thursdays," she said. "Thursday is tomorrow." "Yes, my lady," said Mrs. Pendleton. "It is." The document case reached Harcastle's offices on Thursday morning, accompanied by a sealed letter from Vivian, instructing him to hold the contents securely, to open them only in the event of her explicit request, or in the event of circumstances that would make the contents' existence a matter of public interest. Harcastle, to his very considerable credit, sent back only a single line: "Contents received and secured. I ask no questions. H." Vivian placed his note in the locked compartment of William's desk and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that was not quite relief. Relief was too comfortable a word for what the situation warranted, but was at least the recognition that one essential thing had been done correctly. The documents were safe. Edmund had his copies. She had laid the groundwork with Harcastle. Now she needed Victor to make his next move, and she needed to be ready for it. And she needed to ensure that when it came, whatever form it took, whatever pressure he applied, whatever story he tried to tell about her, she was standing in exactly the right position to use it against him. She straightened the surface of William's desk and stood up and looked at the room around her. The bookshelves, the portraits, the cold November light through the familiar windows, and she thought about something Edmund had said in the hotel on the Strand, quietly, with the careful weight of a man who means exactly what he says. "When this is finished." Not if. When. She held that word in her mind like a small, steady light and went downstairs to face the rest of the day. The invitation arrived on a Friday. It was printed on cream card stock of the finest quality, engraved in the precise copperplate that distinguished genuine aristocratic correspondence from its many imitations, and it requested the pleasure of Lady Vivian Ashworth's company at dinner on the 21st of December at Grosvenor Square, the home of Lord and Lady Cavendish, whose annual winter dinner was among the most significant social events of the London season. Under ordinary circumstances, Vivian would have declined. Her period of mourning made attendance at dinners a matter of delicate social calculation, and she had been managing her public appearances with considerable care since William's death. But the invitation had a handwritten addition at the bottom, in Lady Cavendish's own script. "My dear Vivian, I do hope you will come. William always loved this evening, and your presence would honour his memory. We shall take good care of you." It was the kind of invitation that could not, without social consequence, be refused. She accepted. She did not yet know that Victor had ensured she would receive it. The week before the Cavendish dinner was the most dangerous of all the weeks that had preceded it, though it did not feel that way from the outside. From the outside, from the perspective of the London drawing rooms that continued to process and circulate the story of the Ashworth widow, it appeared to be a week of quiet, appropriate mourning. Vivienne was seen at church on Sunday. She was seen making a brief call on Helena Forsyth on Tuesday afternoon. She was seen on Wednesday morning, entering Harcastle's offices on Bedford Row, which was entirely consistent with a widow managing a complex estate. What was not seen? Edmund Calloway entering those same offices through the rear entrance on Wednesday afternoon, at Vivian's arrangement, to meet with Harcastle directly for the first time. She had decided, after considerable deliberation, that the time for keeping Edmund and Harcastle separated had passed. Victor was moving. The timetable Pemberton had referenced was running out, and Harcastle, who had held the documents for 10 days now without asking a single question, which told her more about his character and his private suspicions than any direct conversation might have, needed to understand what he was holding and why. She was not present at the meeting. She had arranged it, and absented herself from it deliberately, for the same reason she had been absenting herself from direct contact with Edmund for the past 10 days. Victor's social narrative required her to appear isolated, and she intended to appear isolated for exactly as long as it served her. Edmund's note arrived the following morning. Harcastle understands everything. He was, I think, not entirely surprised. He has suspected something was wrong with the estate accounts since the reading of the will, though he had no evidence. He is prepared to act as formal legal representative in whatever proceedings become necessary. He also told me something you should know. 2 days ago, a man came to his offices claiming to represent the railway company's board and requesting access to any estate documents Hardcastle might be holding. Hardcastle told him there were no relevant documents and showed him out. He then, on his own initiative, moved everything to a second location known only to himself. He said to tell you, the house is secure. Vivian read the note with a feeling she recognized after a moment as gratitude. Not the social variety, the kind deployed at funerals and receptions and morning calls, but the real kind, which is quieter and heavier and considerably more rare. Hardcastle had moved the documents without being asked. Edmund had understood the necessity of directness without being pushed toward it. Mrs. Pendleton had facilitated 3 months of clandestine communication without a single misstep or a single word of complaint. She was not, she realized, doing this alone. She had not been doing it alone for some time. She permitted herself 30 seconds of something that was almost warmth, and then she folded the note and burned it and went to choose what she would wear to the Cavendish dinner. The 21st of December arrived with the particular cold clarity of a London winter night that has decided to be beautiful rather than merely uncomfortable. The sky above Grosvenor Square was black and sharp, the stars unusually visible, the gas-lit street reflecting off a thin glaze of frost on the cobblestones. Vivian arrived at the Cavendish house in the Ashworth carriage at 8 o'clock precisely, wearing black silk with a single strand of pearls, and was received by Lady Cavendish, a stout, kind woman of 60, with intelligent eyes and an instinct for the emotional temperature of any room she occupied, with genuine warmth. "My dear," Lady Cavendish said, taking both her hands, "you are very brave to come. William loved this evening," Vivian said. "You said so yourself." "He did." Lady Cavendish looked at her with the particular attention of a woman who sees more than she says. "Go in, my dear. James will look after you." The dinner was for 32 guests, arranged across 2 long tables in the Cavendish dining room, which was hung with evergreen garlands and lit with candles in silver holders that cast a warm, flickering light across the assembled company. The smell was of pine and beeswax, and the rich aroma of the first course being carried from the kitchens. Consommé, she thought, and something with game. She found her place card and sat down, and it was only as she was arranging her napkin that she saw 3 seats to her left across the table, Edmund Calloway. She had not known he would be there. The realization arrived with a complicated mixture of emotions that she did not have time to fully examine. Relief at the sight of a known face, concern at the social visibility of their proximity, and something else entirely that she set aside immediately as impractical. He met her eyes briefly, correctly, with no more acknowledgement than was appropriate between acquaintances at a dinner table, and looked away. Good, she thought. Good. She turned to the gentleman on her right, a retired admiral of considerable age and tremendous appetite, and applied herself to the first course and the task of appearing entirely at ease. It was approximately 40 minutes into the dinner, during the fish course, that she became aware of Victor. He was seated at the far end of the second table, far enough away that direct conversation was impossible, close enough that she could observe him when she chose to. He was, as always, performing beautifully, attentive to his neighbours, appropriately sombre in his personal effect, the picture of a grieving brother navigating the social season with dignity. He had not looked at her directly since she arrived, which was itself a form of attention, the deliberate non-looking of a man who is tracking exactly where she is. It was during the meat course that she noticed what was happening to Edmund. It began subtly enough, the kind of subtlety that is only visible to someone who is watching for it. The gentleman to Edmund's left, a Mr. Hartley whom Vivian knew slightly as a man of considerable social connections and limited independent thought, had shifted in his chair in a way that increased the physical distance between himself and Edmund by several inches. The woman across from Edmund, a Lady Sefton whose opinion carried considerable weight in certain circles, had directed her conversation exclusively to her other neighbour for the past 20 minutes. Small things, individually insignificant but accumulating into a pattern. Someone had spoken to these people before the dinner. Someone had ensured that Edmund Calloway's position at this table would be one of visible, undeniable isolation. And then, between the meat course and the pudding, it became considerably less subtle. Mr. Hartley, after what appeared to be a moment of manufactured courage which Vivian suspected was liquid in origin, turned to Edmund and said, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the 4 nearest guests, "I say, Calloway, damned uncomfortable business all this, the railway affair. I imagine the board will want it sorted before the new year." The table's immediate vicinity went quiet with the special quality of social silence that means everyone is listening and pretending not to. Edmund set down his fork with complete composure. "I imagine they will," he said. "Pemberton was saying," Hartley began. "I wasn't aware you knew Pemberton," Edmund said pleasantly. A slight hesitation. "We've been introduced." "Recently?" Edmund asked. His tone was mild, conversational, utterly without aggression. Vivienne, watching from 3 seats away, felt a cold, clear admiration for his control. Hartley reddened. I don't see what—" "Forgive me," Edmund said with a small, courteous smile. "I was simply curious. The consommé was excellent, wasn't it? Lady Cavendish's cook is remarkable." The conversation around them resumed haltingly, and Hartley turned back to his plate with the deflated expression of a man who had been sent to do something and had not done it well. Vivienne looked down the table toward Victor. He was speaking to his neighbor, his face pleasant, his attention apparently elsewhere, but his jaw was set. She looked back at Edmund and found him looking at her, just for a moment, just long enough to communicate something that was not panic and was not quite confidence, but was the specific, steady quality of a man who has understood what is happening and has decided how to respond to it. She gave him the smallest possible nod. Then the pudding arrived, and the evening continued, and she spent the remainder of the dinner performing perfect social grace with a mind running very fast beneath the surface. It happened as the guests were moving from the dining room to the drawing room for coffee and conversation. The transition, 32 people rising from tables, rearranging themselves, the gentle social turbulence of a dinner party in its later stages, provided both cover and opportunity. Vivian was moving through the doorway between rooms when Victor appeared at her elbow with the smoothness of a man who has planned his positioning carefully. "You seem well," he said quietly, falling into step beside her. "Better than I expected." "The Cavendish hospitality is restorative," she said. "I noticed you acknowledged Calloway." "We are acquainted," she said easily. "It would have been rude not to." Victor was silent for 3 steps. "Vivienne." His voice had shifted, barely perceptibly, from fraternal warmth to something with a harder edge beneath it. "I want to speak to you about the documents I left. It's been nearly 2 weeks. Harcastle has been thorough," she said. "You know how he is. The probate timeline. Victor." She stopped and turned to face him with an expression of mild, apologetic helplessness so precisely calibrated that she was privately rather proud of it. "I promise you I am doing my very best with all of it, but you must understand that William's death has left me genuinely at sea with the financial matters. I am trying. I simply need a little more time." She allowed her voice to soften slightly. "You've been so patient. I'm so grateful." His expression, she watched it carefully, moved through several things in rapid succession. Reassurance, because the performance was convincing. Frustration, because patience was running out. And something else, something colder, that he covered quickly with the habitual warmth. "Of course," he said. "Take the time you need." She thanked him and moved into the drawing room and accepted a coffee she did not drink, and spent 30 minutes being graciously, impeccably social, and did not look at Edmund again for the remainder of the evening. She was almost at the door, her cloak retrieved, her farewells made, when Helena caught her arm. "Are you all right?" Helena asked quietly. "You look— I'm not sure. Something is different." "I'm perfectly well," Vivian said. "Victor spoke to you." "Briefly." Helena studied her face with the worried precision of a woman who knows another woman well enough to see past the performance. "Vivienne, whatever you are doing, whatever this is, please be careful." "I am always careful," Vivienne said. She stepped out into the cold December night and walked to the Ashworth carriage, and the door closed behind her, and in the darkness of the carriage interior, with the horses moving and the frost-bright city sliding past the windows, she allowed herself to be for exactly the length of the journey home, entirely honest about how frightened she was. Victor's jaw had been set at that dinner table. His patience was not just running out. It was gone. Whatever he intended to do next, he intended to do it soon. And then, 2 days later, it happened. Edmund was found. Not in any compromising circumstance of his own making. The circumstance was manufactured with the same neat precision that had characterized everything Victor had constructed from the beginning. A letter purportedly from Vivienne had been delivered to Edmund's address on the 23rd of December, requesting an urgent meeting at a particular address in Bloomsbury. Edmund, recognizing the channel as wrong, Vivienne had been clear about the 10-day silence and the note did not come through Mrs. Pendleton, had gone anyway because the note had contained a detail about the railway ledger that only someone who had seen the documents could have known, which meant either Vivienne had sent it or someone had accessed the documents. He had arrived at the Bloomsbury address to find it was a respectable lodging house. He had found himself, by a series of guided coincidences that he understood immediately as a construction, in a situation where the landlady, who would subsequently prove to have been paid for her account, could report that Lord Calloway had been seen entering a private room at an address associated, tenuously but sufficiently, with a woman of questionable reputation. By Christmas Eve, the story was in 3 drawing rooms. By Christmas morning, it had reached Victor Ashworth, who received it with every expression of horrified fraternal concern, and began, immediately and efficiently, to ensure it travelled further. Vivienne heard about it from Helena on Christmas afternoon, delivered with shaking hands and a face white with distress. The story, as it had arrived in Helena's drawing room, contained Vivienne's name directly. Lord Calloway, it was said, had been conducting a liaison with the Ashworth widow since before William's death. The railway dispute, the financial difficulties, all of it reframed in this version as the complicated aftermath of a betrayal. William had discovered the liaison. William had confronted Calloway, and the accident on the road to St. James's had been— "Stop," Vivienne said. Helena stopped. Vivienne sat very still in Helena's drawing room on Christmas afternoon, with the fire burning and the smell of pine from the decorations and the sounds of Helena's children somewhere in the upper floors of the house, and she understood with complete clarity what Victor had done. He had not simply spread a rumor, he had constructed a counter-narrative, one that explained every element of the real story in a way that destroyed both her and Edmund simultaneously. It reframed the documents, the meetings, the alliance, as evidence of guilt rather than investigation. It gave every person in London who wanted a simple explanation a simple explanation. And it was, she knew, only the first move. The documents would come next. And then the signature, and then the estate. She looked at Helena. "I need you to do something for me," she said, "and I need you to trust me completely." Helena looked at her with frightened, loyal eyes. "What do you need?" "I need you to host a dinner," Vivienne said. "The largest dinner you can arrange in the shortest possible time. Every significant person in London society that you can seat at your table." She paused. "Can you do that?" Yes, I suppose, but Vivienne, why?" "Because," Vivienne said quietly, "I'm going to end this. And I need an audience." The days between Christmas and the New Year had a particular quality in London, a suspended, slightly unreal quality, as though the city had agreed collectively to pause its ordinary operations and exist in a brief interval between what had been and what was coming. The social machinery slowed, offices closed, the great houses of Mayfair settled into a quieter rhythm of family gatherings and private dinners, the streets less busy, the usual channels of information and rumour running at reduced capacity. Victor, Vivienne suspected, had counted on this. The suspended week between Christmas and the New Year was, she understood now, the final element of his timetable. The social season was dormant, the courts were not sitting, Harcastle's offices were closed for the holiday period. Edmund was publicly compromised, and Vivienne, isolated, apparently overwhelmed, her reputation beginning to fray at the edges, was precisely where Victor needed her to be when he arrived with the documents and a pen and the patient, fraternal pressure of a man who has arranged everything in advance. She had 4 days. She spent the first of them writing. The letter she composed on the 26th of December was the most important thing she had ever written, and she wrote it 7 times before she was satisfied with it. It was addressed to Mr. Hardcastle and ran to 4 pages, setting out in the precise and methodical language that she had developed over 3 months of reading ledgers and legal documents and railway transaction records, the complete account of what she knew, what she could prove, and what she believed had happened to William. She had not written it before because writing it made it real in a way that thinking it did not, and making it real meant accepting, fully and without the protective distance of investigative abstraction, that her husband had been murdered by his brother for money. She wrote it anyway. When it was finished, she read it through once, made 2 small corrections, and sealed it with the Ashworth seal. Then she wrote a second, shorter letter to Edmund, which she sent through Mrs. Pendleton's channel. The 10-day silence had served its purpose and was now over, containing 3 sentences. Victor moves this week. I have written everything to Hardcastle. I need the coachman's name. The coachman. James Howell, the man who had survived the accident with a broken arm and a story about horses bolting without warning, and who had subsequently, she had discovered this through Thomas, who had a gift for the kind of quiet, patient inquiry that produces information without appearing to seek it, left the Ashworth household within a fortnight of William's death and taken employment in Bristol, at a coaching inn whose owner had no apparent connection to anyone Vivian knew. Bristol was not so far as to be unreachable, but it was far enough to be convenient if one wished a witness to be unavailable. She needed to know who had paid for that convenience. Edmund's response arrived on the morning of the 27th, and it contained more than she had asked for. Howell is in Bristol, you know this. What you don't know, he did not find the position himself. It was arranged for him by a solicitor's clerk, whose employer I believe you will recognize. The coaching inn's owner is Arthur Pemberton's brother-in-law. I discovered this 2 days ago and have been deciding how to use it. There is more. I have spent the past week, since the Bloomsbury incident, which I want you to know I understood immediately as a fabrication, pursuing a line of inquiry I had previously considered but not acted upon. The accident occurred on the 14th of November, the road to St. James's. I located, through considerable effort, 2 men who were present on that road that evening, a lamplighter named George Satterley and a night watchman named Edward Price. Neither was interviewed by the inspector who visited Ashworth House the morning after the accident. They were not interviewed because no one asked them. No one asked them because the conclusion of accident was reached very quickly by people with reason to reach it quickly. I have spoken to both men. What they saw that evening is not consistent with the coachman's account. I have their statements, written and witnessed. I will come to you tonight. The usual entrance, 9 o'clock. E. Vivian read the letter standing at William's desk in the grey December morning light, and she read it twice, and then she sat down heavily in William's chair and pressed both hands flat against the desk surface, and breathed. 2 witnesses. On the road, who had seen something inconsistent with the coachman's account. She had known with a cold intellectual certainty for 3 months that William had been murdered. She had known it from the letter in the locked compartment, from the ledger, from the transfer documents, from the architecture of the conspiracy that had become clear piece by piece, like a building emerging from fog. She had known it, and worked from it, and built everything on it. But knowing and proving were different things, and for 3 months the knowing had been enough because the proving had not yet been possible. It was possible now. Edmund arrived at 9 o'clock precisely, admitted by Mrs. Pendleton with the quiet efficiency that had characterized her involvement throughout, and Vivian received him in the study, William's study, where it had all begun, where she had first sat with the brass key in her hand and the letter in her lap, and begun to understand that grief was not her enemy. He looked, she thought, different from the man she had first observed across Lady Portsmouth's drawing-room 6 weeks ago. Not physically. He was still the same contained, serious presence, but something in him had shifted in a way that she recognized because she had felt the same shift in herself. The particular quality of a person who has been moving through danger for long enough that the danger has ceased to feel like an interruption to ordinary life and has become instead simply the texture of life itself. He brought 2 documents with him, which he placed on the desk, without preamble. The first was a statement from George Satterley, the lamplighter, written in a careful, slightly laborious hand and witnessed by a magistrate's clerk in Clerkenwell. Satterley had been working on the road to St. James's on the evening of the 14th of November. He had seen the Ashworth carriage. He had seen, before the carriage reached the point where the accident had occurred, a second figure on the road, a man on horseback, positioned in shadow, who had moved out briefly as the carriage approached, and then pulled back. He had heard something. Not a shot, he was clear about that, but a sharp sound like a whip cracked very close to a horse's ear. And then the horses had bolted. The second statement was from Edward Price, the night watchman, who had been positioned further along the road and had seen the horseman ride away rapidly in the direction of Piccadilly after the carriage struck the wall. He had not reported it because, he explained with the honest simplicity of a working man who has learned that such things are not his concern, he had assumed it was some quality of wealthy person's business and that drawing attention to it would only bring difficulty. Vivienne read both statements carefully, twice, with Edmund standing quietly on the other side of the desk. When she looked up, she said, "The horseman." "Yes," Edmund said. "Can either of them identify him?" Satterley cannot. It was dark, and the figure kept to shadow. He paused. Price saw the man's face briefly under a street lamp as he rode away. He described him as dark-haired, well-dressed, riding a grey horse. Another pause. He could not make a formal identification from description alone, but he is prepared to view a likeness. A likeness. She thought about this for a moment. "Victor had a portrait done last year," she said. "It was commissioned for the family gallery at the Lancashire estate. William mentioned it." She paused. "It was painted by Fellows, I believe. His studio is on Regent Street." Edmund looked at her steadily. "If Price identifies the likeness, it is not proof sufficient for a criminal court on its own," she said. "But combined with the ledger, the transfer documents, Pemberton's connection to Howell's employment in Bristol, and the testimony of 2 witnesses on the road." She stopped. "Harcastle will know what it constitutes." "It constitutes enough," Edmund said quietly, "to make a very great deal of noise in the right places." She nodded slowly. They looked at each other across William's desk. Across 3 months of letters burned over candles and meetings in back rooms and documents moved through the city in borrowed hands, and she was aware of the silence of the house around them, the good steady silence of a house whose housekeeper was on their side and whose doors were locked. "I need you to take Price to Fellows' studio," she said. "Tomorrow, if possible, before the new year, before Victor makes his move." "I'll go in the morning," Edmund said. "And I need you to be careful," she said, "more careful than you have been. The Bloomsbury incident tells me Victor is prepared to move against you directly if he believes you are a threat. Now that he knows, or suspects, that the railway records have been accessed, you are a threat." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "Vivienne," he said, and the name still had that quality. Careful, weighted, as though he were aware each time of having crossed some small distance to use it. "I want to say something." She waited. "When this is over," he said, "and I intend it to be over very soon, I want you to know that what you have done here is—" He stopped, and she could see him choosing between several different sentences, which was unusual for a man who was generally very precise in his speech. "William did not deserve what was done to him," he said finally, "and you have made sure it will not go unanswered. That matters. Whatever happens next, that matters." She looked at him across the desk for a long moment. The fire in the grate had burned low. The candle on the desk was near its end. The study smelled of paper and leather and the faintest ghost of William's tobacco, and outside the window London was dark and cold, and the year was almost over. "It matters to me," she said, "because he was my husband and I loved him, imperfectly and companionably as we loved each other, and he was frightened at the end, and he was alone, and I was not there." She paused. "And it matters because if I do not finish this, Victor will take everything William built and William will have died for nothing, and I will not allow that." Edmund held her gaze. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't think you would." The morning of the 28th brought news she had not expected. Thomas appeared at the study door at 8 o'clock with the expression of a young man who has received information and is uncertain whether delivering it quickly or carefully is the more appropriate response. He had resolved the dilemma apparently in favor of quickly. "Mr. Victor Ashworth called at the house this morning, my lady," he said, "at 7 o'clock. Mrs. Pendleton told him you were not yet receiving. He left a note. The note was brief, and it was not in the fraternal register Victor had maintained throughout. It was in a different register entirely, the register of a man who has decided that the performance is no longer necessary. Vivian, I will call again tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I expect the documents to be signed when I arrive. I think you understand that it would be unwise to delay further. The situation with Calloway has become a matter of considerable public interest, and I should hate for it to become more complicated than it already is. I am sure we both want this resolved quietly and in the family's best interest. V. She read it once, set it down, picked it up and read it again. It was, she noted, the first written evidence of direct pressure she had from Victor, vague enough to be deniable in isolation, but clear enough in the context of everything else. She folded it carefully and added it to the locked compartment. Then she sent 3 messages, the first to Hardcastle. He moves tomorrow. I need you available from 10 o'clock. Please come to the house at 9. The second to Helena. The dinner must be this week. Can you do Friday? I will explain everything. Please trust me. The third to Edmund, the shortest of all. Tomorrow at 10. Price must see the portrait today. V. His response came back within the hour. A single line. Price has seen the portrait. He identified it without hesitation. E. Vivian placed the note on the desk in front of her and looked at it for a long time. It was enough. It was, assembled together with everything else, enough. She had one day to prepare, one day to ensure that every piece was in its correct position, every document secured, every person who needed to understand the situation fully briefed. One day before Victor arrived at 10 o'clock with his pen, and his patience finally exhausted, and his fraternal warmth finally discarded. She called for Mrs. Pendleton and spent the rest of the morning going through everything. The sequence of events, the documents with Hardcastle, Edmund's role, the witnesses, the portrait identification, the note Victor had left that morning. Mrs. Pendleton listened with the focused attention of a woman who has been waiting for this briefing for some time and intends to be entirely ready for whatever it requires of her. When Mr. Ashworth arrives tomorrow, Vivian said, I will receive him in the drawing room. I will need you present in the house but not in the room, and I will need Thomas available at all times. Yes, my lady. If anything goes wrong, if I call for you or if I do not emerge from that meeting within 1 hour, I need you to send Thomas immediately to Hardcastle's offices. She paused. Do you understand? Perfectly, Mrs. Pendleton said, in the tone of a woman for whom the instruction was, if anything, somewhat belated. After she left, Vivian sat alone in William's study in the last grey afternoon of the year's dying days, and she was frightened, and she was prepared, and she understood that these two things were not contradictory. They never were in the end. She opened the locked compartment one final time and took out the first letter, William's letter, the one she had found on the night everything had changed, the one written in frightened handwriting with incomplete sentences and the words, God forgive me. I should have told her at its end. She read it through once more. Then she folded it with great care and placed it in the inside pocket of her dress, close to her chest, where it would remain until tomorrow. She wanted him with her, in whatever small way was still possible when it ended. Victor arrived at 10 o'clock precisely. Vivian heard the knock from the drawing room where she had been sitting since 9, when Hardcastle had arrived through the front door deliberately in full view of the street, and taken his position in the small sitting room adjacent, the door between the two rooms left fractionally ajar. Edmund was not in the house. She had decided, after considerable deliberation, that his presence would give Victor exactly the ammunition he needed to reframe what was about to happen as a conspiracy rather than a revelation. Edmund's part was already played. What remained was hers alone. She heard Mrs. Pendleton admit Victor. She heard his footsteps in the hall, confident, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who has arrived to collect something he considers already his. And then he appeared in the drawing-room doorway, and she rose to receive him, and they looked at each other across the room with the full weight of everything unspoken between them pressing on the air. He was carrying the portfolio. "Vivienne," he said. The warmth was still there, but it was thinner now, a coat worn so long it had begun to fray at the edges, the original fabric visible through the worn patches. "You look well." "Thank you for coming," she said. "Please sit down." He sat. She sat. The fire burned between them, and the December morning light came through the windows, and on the low table before them sat a tea tray that neither of them would touch, and beside it the documents he had left 2 weeks ago, still unsigned. "I received your note," she said. "I thought it best to be direct," he said. "We are family, after all. There is no need for the pretense of formality between us." "No," she agreed. "There isn't." Something in her tone, some quality of steadiness that was different from the mild, bewildered effect she had performed throughout their previous meetings, produced a very slight shift in Victor's expression, a sharpening. Not yet alarm, but the precursor to it. "The documents," he said, gesturing toward the table. "Yes," she said. "I want to talk about the documents. Hardcastle has reviewed them. There's nothing complicated." "Hardcastle has reviewed them," she said. "And a great many other things besides." She paused. "Victor, I want to give you an opportunity. Before this proceeds any further, I want to give you the opportunity to tell me the truth." A silence. Victor looked at her with eyes that had gone entirely still. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," she said. "I have read William's ledger. I have read the railway transaction records, the internal records, not the public accounts. I have read the transfer document that Pemberton prepared 6 weeks before William died." She kept her voice level and her hands still in her lap. "I know about the loan arrangement, and the leverage you used to extend it, and the scheme that used the land acquisition process to move funds into accounts you controlled. I know about Pemberton's connection to James Howell's employment in Bristol." She paused. "And I know what 2 witnesses saw on the road to St. James's on the night of the 14th of November. Victor did not move. He was, she noted with a cold, clear part of her mind, an excellent performer, better, in some ways, than she had given him credit for. His face did not collapse. His body did not betray him with sudden movement. He simply went very still in the manner of a man deciding very rapidly which of several available responses best served his position. "That is," he said carefully, "a remarkable collection of allegations." "They are not allegations," she said. "They are documented facts, held by my solicitor and supported by witness testimony." She reached into the inside pocket of her dress and withdrew William's letter. "And by this." She placed it on the table between them without unfolding it. Victor looked at it. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition, she thought, and beneath the recognition, for the first time, something that might have been fear. "William wrote that letter 5 days before he died," she said. "He described what you had done to him. He described his fear of what you would do next." She paused. "He was right to be afraid. He was wrong to keep silent." "William," Victor said, and his voice had shifted into a register she had never heard from him before, lower, stripped of its social polish, something rawer beneath, was a fool. He had every opportunity to manage the situation with discretion. He chose instead to what? She said quietly. To refuse to sign over his estate to the man who was blackmailing him, to decline to make himself complicit in theft beyond what you had already forced him into? She looked at him steadily. "I would not call that foolishness, Victor." He stood up. It was not a violent movement, not yet, but it changed the quality of the room, and she felt the change in her chest, a tightening that she recognized as fear and refused to show. "You have been very clever," he said. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before on his face, because he had never before had reason to show it to her, the expression of a man without a performance left to give. "More clever than I expected. More clever than William told me you were, which was, I confess, not very clever at all." A pause. "But you are alone in this room, Vivienne, and whatever you believe you have assembled, documents, witnesses, solicitors, none of it is present here at this moment. And what I need from you is very simple. You need my signature," she said. "Yes, you will not have it." He moved toward the table, not toward her, but toward the documents, a gesture of repossession. And she said, clearly and without raising her voice, "Mr. Hardcastle." The door between the drawing room and the sitting room opened, and Hardcastle entered. He was followed, to Victor's evident shock, by a second man, a broad, serious-faced man in a plain coat whom Vivian had met for the first time at 9 o'clock that morning, introduced by Hardcastle with the economy of a man who understood that in certain moments clarity of role is everything. "This is Inspector Marsh," Hardcastle said, "of the Metropolitan Police." What followed was not dramatic, in the way that Vivian had sometimes, in the small hours of sleepless nights, imagined it might be. Victor did not confess. He did not collapse. He stood very straight in the drawing-room of Ashworth House, with his portfolio under his arm, and his face composed into the mask of an affronted gentleman, and he told Inspector Marsh that these were private family financial matters being misrepresented by a grief-addled widow under the influence of a man whose own motives were deeply suspect, and that his solicitor would be in contact before the day was out. Inspector Marsh listened with the patient, unrevealing attention of a professional who has heard many versions of many stories and reserves his assessments for later. He then informed Victor, with equal courtesy, that given the documentary evidence and the witness statements that had been submitted to the police that morning, submitted, Vivian noted, watching Victor's face, he was requested to make himself available for formal questioning that afternoon. He was not at this moment under arrest, but he was strongly advised not to leave London. Victor left. The drawing-room was very quiet after the front door closed. Hardcastle looked at Vivian. Inspector Marsh looked at Vivian. Mrs. Pendleton appeared in the doorway from the hall, having apparently decided that her presence was now appropriate, and looked at Vivian. "Well," Hardcastle said after a moment, with the compressed satisfaction of a man who has been holding a great deal in for a considerable time. "That was rather well managed, Lady Ashworth." "Thank you, Mr. Hardcastle," she said, "for everything." She sat down, not in the controlled, deliberate way she had been sitting throughout the meeting, but simply because her legs had decided, now that the necessity of standing had passed, that they would prefer not to continue. Helena's dinner was on the Friday. 3 days after Victor's interview with Inspector Marsh, which had lasted 4 hours, and at the end of which he had been asked to surrender his passport, a detail that had reached 3 drawing-rooms by the following morning, and 2 days after Pemberton had been visited at his Gray's Inn Road offices by 2 police officers, and had, according to Thomas, who had heard it from a clerk's assistant, who drank at the same public house as Thomas's cousin, turned a remarkable shade of grey, and asked immediately for his own solicitor. The dinner was for 28 guests. Helena had assembled them with the swift, sure instinct of a woman who understood that the guest list was itself a statement. People of consequence, people whose opinions shaped the social weather of London, people who would carry what they heard at that table into every drawing-room and morning call and correspondence of the weeks that followed. Vivian arrived last, which was deliberate. She wore midnight blue, not black. It was, she was aware, a statement about mourning and its limits, and she made it with complete intention. She wore William's pearls, and she carried herself with the particular quality of stillness that 3 months of living inside a dangerous situation had built into her body like a second skeleton. Edmund was there. She had ensured it. He was, for the first time since William's death, in a social setting where the architecture of the evening was designed to support him rather than isolate him, and she watched him across the table during the first course with something that felt, she thought, like relief, the deep, substantive kind. Helena had seated them with quiet deliberateness, near enough to speak if the conversation turned that way, but not so near as to produce comment. It was, Vivian thought, exactly the right distance. The dinner was excellent. The conversation moved through the usual social registers, the season, the political news, the various marriages and scandals of the autumn, and Vivian participated in it with the ease of a woman entirely at home in her own social world, which she was and had always been, regardless of what had been happening beneath its surface. It was during the fish course that Lord Cavendish— Helena had been very particular about who asked the question, and Lord Cavendish, a man of 60 with a reputation for blunt good sense, was precisely the right person, turned to Vivian and said in his carrying, genial way, "Lady Ashworth, I understand there have been some developments in the matter of your husband's estate. Dreadful business. Are you able to say anything?" The table's attention gathered toward her with the smooth, inevitable quality of water finding a course. She set down her fork. She looked briefly at the candles burning in their silver holders along the center of the table, at the faces turned toward her, curious, sympathetic, hungry for the story that London had been building and rebuilding for 3 months, and she thought about William writing his letter in the study, and about a road in November darkness, and about a brass key in a locked drawer. Then she told them. Not everything. She was not a fool, and the police investigation was ongoing, and there were limits to what could be said publicly before the legal process had run its course. But enough. Enough of the financial scheme, enough of the documents, enough of the witnesses on the road, delivered in the clear, measured language of a woman who has spent 3 months learning to speak the language of evidence rather than allegation, to make the shape of it entirely clear to everyone at that table. She did not say Victor murdered my husband. She said, "The evidence that has been submitted to the Metropolitan Police suggests that my husband's death was not the accident it was represented to be, and that the financial arrangements made in the weeks preceding it indicate premeditation." She said it quietly, without drama, with the particular force that only very controlled speech ever achieves. The table was completely silent. Then Lord Cavendish said, with the slow gravity of a man pronouncing on something he has already decided, "Extraordinary business, extraordinary woman," and the dinner resumed. It was past midnight when the last guests departed, and Helena found Vivian standing in the doorway to the garden, her cloak around her shoulders, looking out at the cold December dark. "Are you all right?" Helena asked. "Yes," Vivian said, and meant it, for the first time in months, entirely. Helena squeezed her hand and went back inside, and Vivian stood for a moment longer in the cold air, and then Edmund appeared beside her. Having waited, she understood, with the patient, particular courtesy that was characteristic of him, until the appropriate moment. They stood in silence for a while, which was not uncomfortable, because the silence between them had long since ceased to be the silence of strangers. "It was well done," he said finally. "It was necessary," she said. "Both things can be true." She looked at him. In the darkness and the cold, with the light from Helena's windows falling across the garden in warm rectangles, he looked very much like himself. The self she had come to know across 3 months of burned notes and back entrances and small upstairs rooms. The self beneath the controlled reserve that London society had always mistaken for coldness. "What happens now?" she said. "Not about the investigation." She knew what happened now about the investigation. The process, the evidence, the legal machinery that Hardcastle and Inspector Marsh would guide through its necessary stages. She meant something else, and she thought he understood that she meant something else. He was quiet for a moment. "I believe," he said carefully, "that there is a railway company in considerable need of reconstruction, and a woman who has spent 3 months living at a very high level of intensity, who might benefit from a period of—" He paused, choosing. "Ordinary life. Ordinary life," she repeated. The phrase felt strange in her mouth, unfamiliar, slightly theoretical, like a language she had once known and would need to relearn. "I understand it exists," he said, and there was something in his voice, dry and warm simultaneously, a combination she had not encountered in him before and found, she realized, entirely disarming. "I have been told it can be quite pleasant." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she did something she had not done, she realized, since before William's death, since before the letter in the drawer and the ledger, and the road in November darkness, and all the months of fear and determination that had followed. She laughed, quietly, genuinely, the laugh of a woman who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has, finally, been permitted to set it down. Edmund looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was, she thought, the closest thing to one she had yet seen from him. "January," she said, when the laughter had settled. "Give me January. To breathe. To remember what ordinary life looks like." "January," he agreed. She looked out at the cold garden one more time. Somewhere in the city, Victor Ashworth was facing a reckoning that she had built piece by piece from a brass key and a hidden letter, and the refusal to accept that grief was the only thing a widow was permitted to feel. William, she thought, would have found the whole thing remarkable. He would have shaken his head and laughed and said she had entirely too much courage for her own good, and she would have told him that courage was simply fear with somewhere to go, and he would have looked at her the way he sometimes had, in the quieter moments of their 7 years, with a particular affectionate wonder that she had always valued more than he knew. She had not been able to protect him. She had been able to make sure he was not forgotten, and not unavenged, and not reduced to a footnote in the story his brother had tried to write over the top of him. It was not everything, but it was what she'd had to give, and she had given all of it. That matters, Edmund had said in William's study in the last days of the old year. Whatever happens next, that matters. She turned away from the garden. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." And they went back into the warmth and light together, and the door closed behind them, and December moved toward its end. Some stories begin with a letter found in a locked drawer. Others begin with a knock at a door, or a name spoken in a corridor, or a single word written in frightened handwriting by a man who did not know he was writing his last testament. This one began with all of those things, and it ended, as the best stories do, not with a grand resolution that erases everything that came before, but with something smaller and more durable. Two people standing in a cold garden, having chosen, after everything, to go back inside. The law took its course, as law eventually does. Victor Ashworth faced trial in the spring. Pemberton cooperated with the prosecution in exchange for considerations that satisfied no one entirely, which is generally the nature of such arrangements. James Howell returned from Bristol to give testimony, having discovered that distance from London had not, in fact, resolved his conscience. The railway company was reconstructed. Edmund Calloway's reputation was restored, not with the sudden dramatic reversal of a single public moment, but in the slower, more permanent way that truth restores things when it is given sufficient time and sufficient documentation. And Vivienne Ashworth took her January. She spent it quietly, at a small property in the Wiltshire countryside that had belonged to her mother, where the mornings were cold and still, and the afternoons were lit with the thin, clear light of a winter moving towards spring. She read. She slept. She walked in the frozen garden in the early mornings, when the grass was white with frost, and the air smelled of earth and cold, and the particular promise of things not yet begun. And in February, Edmund Calloway came to Wiltshire. He stayed for a week. They walked in the garden and talked about everything and nothing, and in the evenings they sat by the fire, and she discovered that his dry, quiet humour, which had surfaced so rarely in the months of danger, was in ordinary life a near constant presence, and that she found it, without any particular surprise, the best company she had encountered in a very long time. He left on a Friday. On Saturday morning, a letter arrived. It was not a long letter. It was not in truth a particularly elegant one. Edmund Calloway, she was learning, wrote as he spoke, precisely, without ornamentation, with the quiet confidence of a man who says what he means and means what he says. It contained one question. She wrote back the same afternoon. Her answer was yes. Was justice truly served in the end, or do you think some wounds can never fully heal? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, surprised you, or kept you turning pages late into the night, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new tale from the drawing rooms and dark corridors of Victorian England. And if Lady Vivienne's courage spoke to you, leave a like. It takes 1 second and it means the world. Until next time, dear friends, may your secrets be few, your allies be loyal, and your courage always find somewhere to go.